Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special webinar entitled How to Build a Runway to Clinical Translation as a Basic Scientist. We have invited partners who have expertise in early tech transfer, developing a product and bringing it all the way to market, as well as scientific investing, to provide the audience with advice to prepare your research program for potential commercial success. I am Megan Allen, the Scientific Director at Damon Runyon Cancer Research Foundation. And for those in the room today, this doesn't need repeating, but to reiterate, Damon Runyon's mission is simple. We fund the brave and the bold. We provide funding to brilliant young investigators, many of whom are in the room today, to enable them to perform high-risk, high-reward research that leads to breakthroughs in the treatment as well as understanding of all cancers. We have a long track record of success, and over the past 75 years, we have invested over $430 million in nearly 4,000 scientists. With that, I'm delighted to kick off today's webinar and introduce today's moderator, Suzanne Angell, Director of Therapeutics Research at Casdin Capital. So Suzanne, will you take it away and give us a little bit more information about yourself? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan. Thanks for inviting me and for inviting our panelists to this wonderful, wonderful panel. So I am Suzanne Jung Angell. I'm the Director of Therapeutics Research at Casdin Capital. We are a healthcare investment firm, and we invest predominantly in later stage healthcare companies that are in the public markets or approaching the public markets. And so very top of mind to us is, this very important topic about how to translate the incredible science that is being done by scientists like yourselves into products that can have a broader impact for people and for society. And so we have three wonderful panelists representing different parts of that journey from lab to commercial products. And from the tech transfer office to venture capital, which seeds early companies and operate, and then also we have two operators who are leading their companies through that journey to getting their drugs to market. So to introduce our panelists, let's start with Yashodhara. So go ahead.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks so much for including me in this discussion. My name is Yashodhara Das. I'm the VP for Technology Management and Commercialization in the Technology Transfer Office at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. So my team manages inventions that are made by our scientists and physicians at Memorial Sloan Kettering. These are very often therapeutics that can be used to treat cancer, but could include other types of things as well, including diagnostics, devices, software, and recently we've been more and more focused on data and digital assets as well. I've been working at Sloan Kettering for about 15 years now. Before that, I was training as a physician and as an immunologist. And during the past 15 years at MSK, I've been extremely lucky to be able to manage a lot of really cutting edge, promising, really interesting technologies, as well as being involved in new company formation around some of these.
Wonderful. Annie, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Suzanne. Hi, everybody. Annie Mitsak. My background is in biomedical engineering, so did my PhD at University of Michigan, decided not to stay at the bench, so moved to Boston to pursue a role at MIT's licensing office in tech transfer. So did that for about 3 years. It was really fun, got to manage a bunch of different patent portfolios and negotiate license agreements, many of which were with startup companies that the PIs were forming. And it was a great springboard for me to make that pivot from the research side into more of the business side of biotech. So after that experience, I moved on to venture capital. So I joined a VC firm in Boston called Omega Funds, was on the investment team there for about 6.5 years, working on everything from very early stage company creation through to later stage private investments, as well as some public investing, and focused in therapeutics, immunology, and oncology mostly. I left Omega last May, and since July have been heading up a new co in the biotech space. Currently now officially the interim CEO, and we're actively going through the process of defining our strategy and getting some early data. And I'll eventually make my way back to an investing role as well.
Thank you, Annie. Angie?
Thanks, Suzanne. I'm so thrilled to be here with this amazing panel. My name is Angie Yu. My background is also as a scientist. I did my PhD in biochemistry at Harvard, but quickly realized that the lab bench wasn't for me. And I always tell people, you have to figure out what's in your DNA as to what you love. And I realized I loved working with people and teams and kind of like the daily deadlines more akin to business. And so I was lucky enough that McKinsey, a management consulting firm, recruits PhDs. So I always say I did my postdoc in business doing management consulting at McKinsey, learning the business side for a couple of years, but always wanted to do the biotech startup. I had read The $1 Billion Molecule when I was in grad school, and I was just mesmerized by the idea of translating science to drugs to patients and doing it with a team and having that fun and intensity of that small environment. So I've always built my career thinking about being in small companies and moved my way through the industry, mostly through business development, learning how to do deals as a way to fund companies and to fully exploit technologies from a company. I was most recently CEO of a company called Immunix, where Suzanne was a wonderful and supportive investor, and took that from a platform technology concept with some early prototypes of a drug to, in 3 years, mostly during COVID, we built a pipeline where by the time we got acquired by Sanofi 3 years later, we had our first drug heading into the clinic within 3 to 4 months, and then a pipeline of other products heading towards the clinic in the following 18 to 24 months. So kind of seeing drugs from early preclinical, from those early mouse studies to actually meeting people who've been on a drug that you've been a part of. That's why we do what we do. So thrilled to be here to chat.
So, Yashodhara, can you provide us with some historic perspective on how the commercialization of scientific discoveries has changed over the years? What's your view?
Sure. Yeah, just over the 15 years that I've been involved in this space, the nature of technologies that we've been dealing with have been changing. When I started in my position, we used to work a lot with sort of small molecule discoveries, so chemical molecules that are just easier to sort of hand off to a pharmaceutical or biotech company, and then they take it from there and advance them. Nowadays, we deal much more with more complex technologies, biologics, cell therapy, radio-labeled antibodies, things that require a much longer collaboration between institutions such as ours and the companies that are taking them on, because manufacturing these involve complicated processes that need to be handed over appropriately. The other type of trend we've been seeing is that because these technologies are so complex, often they involve input from multiple investigators, and these investigators may be at more than one institution. So our scientists are often collaborating with institutions across the country or in different countries, and they come together to work on these more complex projects. And so for us, the work of commercializing these types of technologies gets a little more complicated as well, because now we're dealing with sort of joint ownership issues. The different institutions which own these technologies have to sort of collaborate as well and decide together on the best path forward.
Anything to add from the investor perspective?
Sure. Yeah, I think from the investor perspective, we're seeing a lot more funds with a new co-creation focus, or at least component of what they do. And so, the firms are building their teams with people who have, very strong technical chops, who have, done drug development in the past, and who can really speak to PIs at institutions on a very, deep level. So I think there's a lot more of that going on, and this kind of, I guess, willingness to create and establish long-term relationships, understanding that, you're not going to meet a researcher, one day and be doing a deal the next day, but rather it's establishing the communication and that trust between the investigator and the firm that then, hopefully one day leads to creation of a company to push something forward.
Absolutely. So, many of our listeners today are scientists from geographic areas that have fewer resources than the life science hubs like Boston and San Francisco, which is also where the venture firms are concentrated. So, Annie, I'm curious what advice you have for people, for scientists in some of these areas.
Yeah, so I did my PhD at Michigan, so I was in the Midwest for that, and so I experienced a little bit of what it's like to be in an area that is not on the coast and doesn't have the influx of venture capital. And I think on the one hand, it's actually, as an investor now, it's kind of exciting and fun to seek out investigators and really good science in places that are not, Boston and San Francisco, because there is really great science being done in many institutions across the country. So I think, as like I mentioned previously, there are so many firms doing company creation, and so it can get kind of competitive to be all sort of talking to the same people in Boston or San Francisco. So kind of going out of that comfort zone, so to speak, for me is really refreshing and exciting and kind of a fun challenge. I think in terms of advice, networking can be super powerful, and establishing connections with people who aren't in your geographic area and maybe are in Boston or San Francisco and have their connections to people there, that can be really powerful. So it often only takes one conversation with somebody maybe in Boston, if you're not located there, that can then open up doors to a number of other connections that can be very powerful and helpful as you think about taking that next step towards translating your research out of the lab.
Angie, as an operator, what advice do you have, or how have you viewed different geographies?
Yeah, I have always been one that it's all about the people and find the best talent wherever they are, right? So even before COVID, I was very open-minded as to where I found my talent. And the reality is, in a biotech company, there are people who need to be in the city, going to the lab every day. But then there are scientists, whether it's computational folks, other types of people who don't need to be in the lab every day. And from that standpoint, I love being able to access talent all over the country. So at Immunix, we had people, who were working remote from the Midwest, from Oklahoma. It was fantastic for us to access different talent because, as Annie mentioned, the war for talent is very intense in places like the Bay Area and Boston. And I totally agree with Annie. It's all about a certain level of hustle. Like, if you are excited about biotech and you want to access being part of that community, go to your scientific conferences. There are a lot of people in biotech who are going into those conferences. There are great opportunities to interact with people. Look up, some of our people we found from the Midwest, we even moved them to the Bay Area. They found our job posts and they applied, and they were fantastic hires where we were open to saying, okay, we'll move you, we'll sponsor your visa. Again, I think when it comes to talent, there are a lot of CEOs now who are way more open-minded as to looking broadly beyond just their own kind of local geography.
Absolutely. And I'm just reminded, like, someone on my team was getting her PhD in St. Louis, and she ended up at some conference in Chicago, which was a few hours away, and ended up getting a job at Regeneron, and slowly made her way to being on Wall Street. So it's incredible how just that hustle can take you to unexpected places. Yashodhara, I'm just curious, each ecosystem outside of Boston and San Francisco, right? It all has a different character. Any thoughts to share about the New York ecosystem?
Yeah, I would say that, New York doesn't seem, like a particularly remote place. And so, you would think that we would have access to everything we need. But at the same time, the biotech hubs in the country are really in Boston and in California. So we are often faced with the same kinds of challenges that you might see in more remote places. So just lack of, VCs in the area. One weird thing, obviously, is just the high cost of space. And so for our startup companies, finding lab space can be a real challenge. It's nice for people to be able to get some space to be able to sort of play around with their ideas and so on. And at Sloan Kettering, we just can't offer that space because it's at a high premium, as is any other lab space that's available throughout the city. The way that we try to deal with this is sometimes when we'll try to strike early partnerships with companies. Even if a product idea is not sort of fully developed, we'll enter into collaborations with industry, and sometimes we can get them to sponsor space for our scientists. So we have a couple of partnerships at least where the companies have been willing to set up sort of a regional center within New York for our scientists to be able to go there and do experiments that benefit the startup company. And then just sort of, going back to this idea of the hustle, for any sort of young scientists who are looking for funding and are listening to this, one way, we have tried to engage the sort of pharmaceutical and investor community is by including people from that community as part of our advisory boards. We have an internal grant mechanism within Sloan Kettering. It's called the TDF, the Technology Development Fund. And we have investors and people from pharma and biotech join that funding mechanism as reviewers. And that's a nice way to sort of maintain contacts with those people. And then, of course, I definitely support the notion of attending as many conferences as possible to try and maintain those relationships as well.
So, Yashodhara, you work with a lot of scientists at MSK. And so, everyone makes mistakes. So what are some of the common ones that you see your scientists making when thinking about translating their discoveries into products?
Sure. Yeah, I don't even know if I would call them mistakes, but one challenge for scientists is that everyone is operating in this sort of area of focus. That is the nature of science nowadays, that you're really, really sort of intensely looking at one particular area of science. That could have been part of somebody's PhD thesis, part of their research. The only way to succeed is being so sort of, deeply enmeshed in one particular space. The scientists are often focused on creating really good science, but in order to be able to translate an idea, they have to think about how that science can be turned into a product or a service that can benefit patients. My team is often involved in trying to sort of support them through that thought process. So whatever cool science an investigator is involved in, thinking through how that can be transformed into a product can be challenging. It's easy to be a little myopic about that, to think in terms of how cool the science and how innovative the science is, and then not be able to think through all the way to a product or service.
Angie, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that partnership with academia and licensing groups is so critical. And the thing that I see often is something I'm terrible at, which is actually kind of this impatience, I want to get this out there. I think this is a company. And I tell so many academics, like, be patient, let the technology and the science prove out some more, because the reality is investors have been burned. They've all lived taking something out of academia and not being able to reproduce those results from a third-party lab. So any way you can get pieces of evidence from different people, that's incredibly valuable. And I think a lot of it's to listen and know what you don't know, right? Because as Yashodhara said, like, you think your baby is the most beautiful, but it may not be what it takes to start a company. It may not be the foundation. So listen to smart, experienced people around you to get that advice, to direct you, okay, these are the key experiments I would need to really make this a success. You want to, if it's your baby, set it up for success, and be patient and work with the right people and listen.
Annie, anything to add? You have a lot of experience on the investor side. So what have you seen?
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly it's not going to be much different from what these two already mentioned. I think definitely, yeah, listening to people who've done it before. I mentioned before having that openness to build a relationship with, well, certainly your tech transfer office, but then also with investors or someone from the biotech community who's done this before, who can actually help guide your experiments. I mean, I've been in conversations with researchers where we're like, look, for us to seed this, we want to see, X, Y, Z. And I think that the challenge that sometimes then presents itself is the experiments perhaps that we want to see, or the data we want to have generated, might not be supported with an NIH grant, for instance. And so there's a little bit of that disconnect. And similarly, the work that you are doing to eventually publish a manuscript might look quite different from the work you want to do to sort of translate it to that company ready stage. So those are definitely, I think, common sort of points of like contention, not contention, I don't know what the right word is, but one way, certainly, Yashodhara mentioned that she's got internal funding at MSK, and I think a lot of institutions these days have kind of that gap funding. So it'll fund experiments that the NIH doesn't fund, but experiments that perhaps the VC firm doesn't quite want to fund yet. They want to see those data first. So those are really good resources to take advantage of. And just again, these ladies already mentioned this, but kind of understanding like what is that right set of experiments to really design and carry out so you can get that super meaningful data.
Excellent points, Annie. So Annie, can you expound on sort of what types of projects are more likely to succeed and to get funded in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, sure. So, I think right now we're in the midst of, a bit of a downturn, particularly in the biotech market. And so there's a lot of tightening of belts, and, investors are looking inward to their existing portfolios and making sure that those companies are well funded and kind of taken care of before perhaps looking for new investments. And so when they look for new investments, the bar is even higher than it normally is. I think given that there is this climate and it's difficult to raise money, every dollar really counts. So investors are looking to put money into things where they can actually see a line of sight to a product that can get to a patient. I think it's really challenging right now to fund big idea platforms that might be really cool science and maybe in 5 or 10 years a product comes out of it, but there's not really that more near-term line of sight to an actual product. And I think those are pretty challenging right now, and they just can be very high burn in terms of the money and the investment that has to go into those. So, I think certainly products that are defined, of course, if they're coming out of academia, they're still going to be early, but if you can at least, create what that looks like to get to a product, I think that's at least, what I'm seeing is sort of more feasible for investment.
Yeah, Yashodhara, or Angie, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I agree with Annie. Unfortunately, I think investor sentiment today, but the pendulum, I'm always the optimist, the pendulum always swings the other way, but there are very few investors today, I think, who are willing to invest in like groundbreaking innovation that might take 5 years to a drug, right? They're not willing to take risk on here's the best new set of targets. Even, you know, so it's going to be a lot more work to convince people to take those leaps of faith today. And that's why that kind of patience and kind of incubating your work continually in your own lab, being creative and finding places to get funded. I think that's just the reality. It's sad. I mean, there are those rare people who will invest occasionally in those big ideas. But then you're going to have to find someone super experienced and successful in biotech to take that on, because that's honestly the only way it's going to get funded, I think, today.
And Yashodhara, I mean, you're right at the front lines with your scientists. So, you know, what advice are you giving at this point in time?
Yeah, I think we're seeing definitely things that are very similar to what Annie and Angie just mentioned. We're seeing more interest in things that have very clearly defined sort of milestones and timelines attached to them. For term sheets, we keep getting asked, how far a particular project is from an IND filing from the first clinical trial, because I think that investors and companies want to know how soon they'll be able to reach that sort of, close value inflection point, at which time, they can, it might be possible to get more funding and so on. So I think for us, it just means, doing more homework internally, trying to, like Angie mentioned, just incubate stuff more for longer before we try to sell our things. And there are non-dilutive sources of funding available, like grant funding, internal grant mechanisms, SBIRs, and so on, that might be much more valuable right now in this tight market. And the idea would be to try and advance something until that stage when, you can have those clearly defined milestones and that sort of tight timeline to reaching a clinical trial stage.
So, Yashodhara, on the topic of sort of institutional support, particularly when it comes to taking on risky projects that are also really expensive projects to see to fruition, I think it'd be great if you could share your perspective on how MSK has funded some of those risky projects.
Sure. Yeah. So, one thing that I had already mentioned, this internal funding mechanism, that has been, I would say, super successful in taking on projects which were not quite ready to reach external partners. And so that program of internal funding has now been ongoing for upwards of 10 years. I think it's probably like 13 or 14 years now. And it's led to many more valuable licenses for us than would have been possible without it. And so I think that's, and that was something that the institution was willing to sort of invest in pretty early on before, other institutions got into this process of funding gaps. And then the other sort of thing I'll mention is sometime in around 2010, the institution also decided to invest quite heavily in cell therapy. And so they created a center for cell engineering, which is still like really state of the art, is capable of manufacturing cells that can go into patients. CGMP level cell therapy products. And that was very unusual at the time. There were not many institutions that were doing that. It was a very heavy investment. It took time and resources, which are always scarce for an institution like ours, to create. And then we invested heavily also in running clinical trials in the cell therapy space. again, at a time when cell therapy was not in vogue. It was a little bit of a pipe dream. And I would say that that investment has really paid off. Like, I think that MSK is seen as a pioneer of sorts in the space. We've run a lot of really key clinical trials using cell therapy products, and MSK innovations and our scientists are also really well known in the space.
Annie, so you're in the middle of a risky project right now as well. I think it'd be great if you could share sort of what you're doing for our audience.
Yeah, no, and I think, and any investment that a venture capitalist makes is certainly risky. So I feel like I'm in the business of risk. But yeah, the current project or a company that I'm working on is I'm in the midst of it. It's a very early stage seed stage company. We did manage to get some seed funding. It is a tranched seed, so I think that's reflective of the investor environment where there is not appetite to throw $20-30 million at something right off the bat. So we're having to be very thoughtful with how we spend the money and trying to really design the best experiments that we can to get meaningful data to then influence a decision at that point. It's a white space area, one that is exciting because there have been some failures in the past in the area, and we think we have a new angle as to how to address those failures and hopefully unlock kind of a new target space with a lot of applications across many different disease areas. So I think that's what's motivating every day as we navigate, what's our strategy and how do we build our team and what experiments do we do, what data do we want to generate, is just thinking about how really impactful this could be. I can't say whether or not it's paid off yet because I'm in the midst of it, but I think, for me, obviously the ultimate win is to get one of these programs into the clinic and into patients, and that's really the ultimate win, and for it to become a drug. But I think there are other ways for it to pay off, both from informing the field about new hopefully discoveries we make can kind of inform the field and advance the field more. Certainly, personally for me, I'm already learning a ton, as is I think the rest of the team who's working on this. I think there are different ways to kind of win along the way, and so just trying to keep my eyes wide open and take advantage of those things along the way.
Well, we all need luck, so I wish you all the luck in this context. And so, but as taking on this big risk, as the interim CEO of this kind of this company, I'm just curious, and maybe not just for this company, but for your career up to this point, what do you think has allowed you? What trait has allowed you to excel in your role?
So I think one of the most important things is just being a good partner and just being someone who people want to work with, someone who's trustworthy and to steal Angie's word, who hustles. I think that goes a really long way because it is all about the relationships and the people along the way, whether you're trying to recruit people or trying to convince investors of an idea. It's all about creating that relationship and being someone that others want to work with. Like life is short, and I think people want to work with good people who are fun to work with and they can trust. So I know that seems like very simple, but for me, I've sort of stayed true to who I am, and that's very important to me.
Angie, what has it been for you? What characteristic?
Well, I think that especially as a female operator, in particular, I think the bar is just always higher. I mean, we have to prove ourselves and we have to be better. So I think one is that building trust through just getting shit done and executing and showing that you can do it, right? Like that is, fortunately or not, especially the female leaders I see, they have that characteristic, right? They've got their intensity where I am going to get stuff done. I can multitask, and you know, I'm not going to overpromise, you know, underdeliver. I think that's critical for the relationship building and building of the trust. I know I've always thrived. I think to what Annie said, I've thrived in environments where I can authentically be myself. And I've definitely been in places where I felt like almost like I was in a straitjacket or I couldn't be myself. And I couldn't thrive in those environments. I mean, I did fine, but I wasn't happy. It wasn't a place where I could really blossom. And it's something that I always tell people, whatever you do, find that environment and culture. And this is why I think culture is so important for companies, where you really feel like you can authentically be yourself. And I feel like that's my role as a CEO, right? Like I'm the architect of the greenhouse so that all my employees can, you know, I need to create the environment where they can all thrive. Like that is like bring the best out in people. So, you know, it's a lot of, you know, just the fundamental get stuff done and show you can do it, especially as a female woman of color. But also, you know, I think a lot of it's that hustle and, you know, to a certain extent, my impatience is both my strength and my weakness, right? I used to judge myself constantly. Oh gosh, I'm so impatient. I've gotten feedback. I'm like way too short with people. I'm too intense. But I had a coach tell me, look, don't judge it that way. It's a muscle, right? And sometimes that muscle is like really important. It's why you get stuff done. But it's also where you flex that muscle. And so it's a fun emotional intelligence journey as you grow in your career.
Thank you so much, Angie, for sharing. And Annie, I think such an important question. So Yashodhara, can you share what you think has made you successful to this point?
So I guess like a little bit of an ability to think outside the box. I mean, when I joined Tech Transfer, it was being practiced in a very specific way. It was very passive in the sense that you would wait for people to come to you when they read journal publications and so on. And I think we've been able to transform the office into into something else, like a much more sort of active office where we are reaching out to people. We're doing deals that are different from sort of traditional licensing arrangements. And so I think, yeah, the ability to be flexible and just think a little bit differently from the way other people might be. And then, the second attribute I would think is just being able to be sort of calm about things that are happening, because I've been around this space for long enough that I can see that things are really cyclical. Initially I used to get very perturbed if something didn't go a particular way, or if a potential partner walked away, or the market was down. But things just come around. And very often problems sort themselves out. So just being able to maintain some calmness and being patient and being able to being willing to sort of wait for things to change.
Well, as a beneficiary of that, I think that's certainly one of your fine talents. So, in any case, I think we obviously all don't get to where we are on our own, and mentorship is such an important topic. And so, Angie, I was hoping you could share your advice for setting up successful mentor-mentee relationships.
Yeah, I think the best of those relationships are really organic. It's very hard to just program and ask someone, will you be my mentor, right? It's the best mentors I've had in my career were themselves had amazing mentors. And it's kind of this magnetism, like you find each other, right? And it's as much as a mentor is giving to you, you're giving as much back to a mentor. As I'm now old enough where I'm, mentoring and advocating for people, I always say I'm getting so much back, right? And it's a certain personality type that I always look for in people, and the people I hire is, be a sponge, like be like always curious and wanting to learn, but always demonstrate that you're willing to, work hard for it, right? One of the pivotal mentors in my career was my undergrad research advisor, Greg Verdine at Harvard, where I saw him give a talk, and I was just like, I just thought his research was so cool that I don't know what got into me, but I went to his lab on a Saturday morning. He was in the office holding one of his babies, working because he was an assistant professor and he was working all the time. And I made my pitch and I said, I just love the work you do. Like I said, I will do anything to get in your lab. Like I will wash glassware for you, like whatever you need, if you just give me a chance. And I had this whole pitch and he's like, yeah, sure. And rather than making me wash glassware, he gave me my own project that was just discreet and it was substantial, that it was probably the highlight of my academic career. Like that went into a Nature paper, right? So, and he's the one, I never like sought him out, but he saw that I was just so passionate about research that, I was never even going to classes. I still have nightmares. Like I didn't go to class and I've got a final exam because all the times I spent in the lab as an undergrad. And I remember one day he said to me, Angie, you should go to grad school. Like you love this. And I remember thinking, I said to him, I said, you think I can get into grad school? Like I just had no idea and I was clueless. I wasn't looking to him as a mentor, but I think, I worked hard. I was passionate. Any opportunity I was given, I jumped at it. Like I'm just drawn to young people like that who have that fire in their eyes. And so I think it really has to be organic. It doesn't work if someone just comes to me and says, well, will you be my mentor? Right.
Annie, do you have anything to add or to share from your own experience?
Sure, yeah. No, I love those stories, Angie. That's awesome. And I agree. I think it has to be organic. I've definitely been part of formal mentoring programs where you're sort of matched with a mentor, maybe it's a group, and I think there are benefits to those, but certainly when it happens organically, I think it's much more powerful. And I think it goes back to kind of that power of networking and sort of never being afraid to have a conversation that maybe you don't think is going to go anywhere, but it ends up being really valuable and fruitful and turning into a whole relationship. So I think, yeah, certainly that's huge, is to always be open to meeting new people. And then I guess just the last thing I'll say is, we all wear different hats, whether it's, mostly professionally, but I think also, our personal lives can't help but intersect with our professional lives these days, especially when everyone's working so many hours on Zoom and remote and everything else. So I think I've ended up finding mentors who, can kind of guide me in different ways and sort of be helpful depending on whichever hat I'm wearing. So I think that's also just sort of being open to kind of seeking out those different types of mentors as well.
Yashodhara, do you have anything to add from your own experience or anything to share about your own mentors?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously highly recommend being a mentor and having a mentor. It's been so important to me to be sort of guided by so many people in my life, especially coming from India, not knowing the country at all. I came here as a 25-year-old, didn't know what I was doing with myself, what was expected and so on. So I've been very fortunate to have received guidance from so many people, and I hope to be able to do the same for others now. One thing I will say, in the space of sort of scientific mentorship, which we see a lot of at our institution, obviously everyone does need mentors to sort of show them the right path. But there's a little bit of a risk there as well. What we sometimes see is that young scientists who are either working in the lab of someone or have been working in the lab of someone, and then they sort of go off on their own to do their own research. Sometimes they tend to get stuck in the research that their mentors were doing, instead of thinking sort of differently and innovatively. And that can be a shame because, while it's great to learn the right processes and the right way of thinking and so on, it's necessary for younger investigators to sort of diverge from what their mentors might have been doing. So, when we get new inventions from scientists, it's often because they have been willing to think differently from the people that they were taught by. I would keep that in mind.
Suzanne, can I add something that I'm really passionate about, and as we speak about yourself being a mentor, is something that we talked about in this group of female CEOs in biotech that I helped co-organize, is a discussion around shifting mentorship to being an advocate. And frankly, for a lot of women, people of color, being a defender, right? So mentorship is more like kind of an inward between two people. Taking it to the next level of being an advocate is putting your own self kind of at risk to advocate for someone. And like I said, Greg Verdine, who was a mentor to me as an undergrad, he was a huge advocate as I made my way into biotech, and he had so many relationships, and I would hear how he would just, give me that advocacy without me even asking for it, right? And that is, you're putting yourself on the line when you do that. But I think that shift in thinking as a mentor to an advocate is so powerful, right? Instead of just mentoring someone on, here's what would make a good board member, like, yell at your VC friends, like, this is an amazing person, like this person should be on a board, a really good board, right? Like that's that next step. And Frank, unfortunately, what I have learned the longer I've been in the industry and the more senior I've gotten is, especially if you're a person of color, a female, and there's a great Harvard Business Review article about this, it's just, again, the bar's higher. So oftentimes, many of us female CEOs have dealt with, there's negative chatter about that woman, right? Like, oh, she's difficult, she's got sharp elbows, like things that in men is totally acceptable. And for women, you have to be like, walk this very narrow line of, I don't want to say perfection, but that just is, it comes with the territory. So we, as a group of female CEOs, have come to defend our fellow sisters with recruiters, with VCs who say, I don't know, that person, we hear she's difficult. And we'll come back with tons of data and information. You've got it all wrong. And I'll point out unconscious bias to remind people, hey, like, let's look at some of these candidates differently. And I do the same with, I see it with, let's say, foreign nationals with an accent. Oftentimes they're not given the titles, the comp, because of the accent, where I'm like, let's give this person a chance, right? And let's take away some of our biases. But that takes a very different shift from mentorship to this advocacy defendership.
Such an important message. Thank you so much for emphasizing it. And it's really inspiring and motivating in terms of all the different ways that we can support each other. On that note, or maybe slightly differently, Angie, I think, if you go back 15 years and had to give yourself a single piece of advice, what would it be?
It's the advice I give every single young person today is, work with great people, right? Do your diligence. Don't get lured by fancy big names and degrees. Work with good, kind people. Like that is, like Annie said, my mantra is always life is short. I don't mind people who are tough. I love getting feedback. That's the fastest way to grow, but work with kind. We had a rule at Ammunix, no egos, no jerks, no politics. it's all about the people. You know, when you work with great people and create a great culture, 1 + 1 = 10. So prioritize that over titles, you know, any of that. It's just constantly follow good people with integrity, and do your diligence around people. You know, talk to as many people it's that hustle to keep learning. It's the same skills as a scientist you need to have as you go into the business world.
Annie, what is your piece of advice for your younger self?
My younger self, yeah. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think it would be to embrace and learn to love networking, which I can say now I have done that, but my like coming out of grad school self was definitely not in that mindset. And you know, it took a lot of uncomfortable situations and such for me to realize how valuable that is and how important it is. I mean, I even remember, so like a little story, when I was kind of thinking about my next steps out of grad school into my first role, I had, you know, gone to Boston and done all these one-on-one meetings with people in various, you know, MIT, consulting firms, I think biotech companies, just to kind of have those informational interviews. And I was telling one of my kind of, you know, classmates in grad school about this experience, and he was like, I had no idea I could do that, you know, with this PhD that I'm working on. And so that was like kind of an aha moment for me to realize, like, wow, doing these sorts of things can be really powerful. And then it was also like a moment of sort of paying it forward and sharing that experience with a peer to help that person navigate, you know, their next step. So I think all it is to say that just, you know, I think all of my, you know, jobs and roles I've really gotten through networking and talking to people and learning about what those roles are like, and you know, what companies out there might be interesting. So I think, you know, for those of you out there who are finishing up programs or looking to transition or looking for potential investors for a new co you're thinking about, you know, being open to that networking is really important.
Suzanne, I want to make sure people understand that whether you're an introvert or extrovert, you can do the networking, right? Because I think sometimes, like, I remember when I was a scientist, I viewed networking almost as a pejorative word, you know,
Totally. Yeah.
like, oh, that's like sleazy or whatever. But it's really, I think, again, just being your authentic self. And if you're passionate about something, sharing that with people. And it does take practice. I mean, I'm a crazy extrovert, and yet I remember I felt like I had to practice. Oh, I've got to go up to someone I don't even know and start talking to them. Like, that was really intimidating to me. And what I learned is I just force myself to do it. And the more you do it, the more natural it comes with practice. Anyone can do that.
Really. Yeah. And to that point too, Angie, I think for me, like, I first thought I have to go to this big event where I don't know anybody, and that's the only way to, you know, quote unquote network. And then I learned, like, no, actually, I operate much better, and it's more fruitful for me if I, you know, ask for someone to introduce, you know, look on someone's LinkedIn, like, oh, I know this person and they know this person I want to talk to. So, you know, ask for that direct connection and have a one-on-one, you know, conversation versus, like, you know, go into this large group of people you don't know, which can be much more intimidating. I did have to do that and still do that sometimes, but I think finding kind of what works for you in terms of how to get the most out of those connections.
Wonderful advice. Yashodhara, anything, you know, what has it been for you in terms of the single piece of advice that you would give?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a theme here. I mean, the advice is very similar and has to do with people. You know, I would say that to me, the most important thing is sort of maintaining good relationships, even just with the people that you come into contact with. So even if you're not going out of your way to, like, network and meet new people and so on, we come into contact with so many people in our professional and everyday lives. So just, you know, getting to know them and maintaining good relationships with them has been super useful to me. And I wish that I'd done even more of that in my past life, just because sometimes we're just too busy. When we're negotiating a transaction, for example, we're so focused on getting the right terms and so on, that we lose sight of that relationship between us and the person on the other side. But really, it's been people like that, people even within the institution who I've connected with on a different level that have been useful, and that it's been sort of a pleasure to work with again. I've even had people who have sort of left my team to go on to other jobs, and sometimes they've come back because I've had good relationships with them. So my advice would just be, even when you're in sort of the, focused on getting the deal done or getting something done, to not lose sight of the fact that on the other side there is an actual person, and to maintain a good relationship with them.
So I agree fully with everything that has been said here. And it's exactly what we are doing here. We've met each other all through networking, and we've maintained relationships as we've continued to go on to different things and different companies, different projects. And I too wish I'd only done it sooner, or taken that extra meeting. And I think that's just such an important piece of advice for everyone on the call today. We don't have time for questions. I did want to share that all four of us are available, and Megan from Damon Runyon will be sending out our email information. So feel free to reach out to us if you have questions, any specific questions for us. We'd be happy to talk with you. So thank you, Annie. Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Yashodhara, for sharing all your perspective on this important topic.
Thank you, Suzanne and Damon Runyon.
Thank you so much.
Great. Yes, thank you all for attending, and thank you to the panelists and excellent moderator. We were thrilled to have you here, and hopefully the audience really had some really nice takeaways. And so for everyone in the audience, I will be sending a follow-up email with the contacts of all of our panelists and moderator, as well as a link to this video recording of the panel. So once again, thank you very much. Have a nice day, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.